I'm Kimberly Springer, curator of the Oral History Archives at Columbia, or OHAC. OHAC is home to one of the world's largest and oldest oral history collections. Our collection, founded in 1948, focuses on a range of topics in the humanities, social sciences, business history, and the arts. Our collections also feature activist histories of the New Left, civil rights and peace movements, as well as community histories. Individual interviews illuminate social, political, and cultural history through the telling of life stories. In this short presentation, I'll discuss how the evolution of the Oral History Archives at Columbia tells us a meta-history of oral history as a discipline. I'll also give you a brief overview of archives and how oral history intersects with that. Knowing something about the history of oral history and archives will give you some insights into why the oral history collection at Columbia looks like it does, who was included in the historical record, and who was excluded. And what does it mean to create a reparative, more inclusive archive? So what is an archive? First, let's talk about what makes archiving different from collecting. Are archivists just institutional hoarders? I'd say there's some judgment involved in hoarding, collecting, and archiving. There are judgments about the people doing those activities, but there are also judgments about the objects being saved and how those objects are saved. To learn more about the distinctions between hoarding, collecting, and archiving, I'd recommend checking out this Reply All podcast about Marion Stokes. Stokes was a television producer, librarian, civil rights activist, early Apple computer investor, and she amassed one of the largest collections of cable news broadcasts in the United States. As you listen to the podcast, consider, how did Stokes's hoarding, that she may have called collecting, become a collection in an archive? What tools and features made her collection an archive? So Stokes's cable news collection and other materials are housed with the Internet Archive. Take a minute to consider what you see from this Internet Archive listing that turns Stokes's work from collection into archive. There are lots of features, such as metadata, or data about data. That metadata includes media types, dates, titles, etc. Information that makes her materials searchable. Stokes's materials, as you can see on the left, were meticulously labeled, which made archival processing and cataloging easier. Her materials are also organized with knowable icons, such as the film strip, a word bubble for commenting, and a star for favoriting materials if you create an Internet Archive account. In other words, Stokes's collection became archival with some help from an institution that specialized in archiving and had archivists working for them. Stokes's efforts on this front, of course, did not go to waste. So here are some things that make an archive an archive. For one thing, archives contain unique objects. You can't get the things in archives just anywhere. Archives are also records of information in a fixed form. Fixed forms include writings, recordings, film, photos, buttons, electronic files, and a number of other materials. Archives are not a backup. Archives are different from backups because, well, theoretically, backups can be restored. Once something is in an archive, it's being taken care of for the long term because presumably there is no other copy or very few copies. Next, let's talk about periodization, or how we think about time as it relates to archives. Periodization is simply dividing time and events into discrete parts or eras for analysis. In the case of archives, the periodization of archives tells us a lot about, one, the politics of a time period, also what or who was valued during a time period, who was considered important. There's a caveat though. Just because the collecting priorities changed over time doesn't mean that those priorities stopped being important or pursued. There are lots of different archives and they have different priorities. Archives start with the historical manuscripts tradition. And this was an emphasis on the historical value of individual documents. So a limit on this tradition would be a narrow construction of history, truth, and also historical worthiness. Second, you have the public archives tradition. This was an emphasis on the legal and administrative value of archives, and it was reinforced by the establishment of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. in 1934, with holdings that date back to 1775. The public archives tradition also has limits on which institutions' records were deemed historically worthy and which government officials' documents are historically significant. From the 1960s onward, parallel to the new left turn in social history, we have a broadening of the collecting tradition in archives. There's a shift from a great men focus to history from the bottom up. This reflects social movements and also the changing status quo around race, gender, class, and sexuality. Archives are responsive to both shifting population dynamics and public policy developments. Today, we might say we're in a contemporary archiving period that values community archives. We think of people and communities not only as objects, but also as subjects and central agents of archives. This is a shift from historians and archivists deciding what's historically relevant to communities being self-determining by creating and maintaining archives. Now let's look at how oral history develops on its own timeline, but also how those developments intersect with the periodization of archives. The Columbia Oral History Archives began in 1948, and they started as a way to fill in the gaps of history. Those gaps included biographical interviews with quote-unquote notable figures in philanthropy, business history, medicine, science, the law, etc. We also have a shift in the 1960s, similar to archives, to oral histories that look at grassroots and social movements, as well as community history. And today we're in a period where oral histories created by, for, and about communities are relevant and increasingly being collected by archives. This includes biographical interviews with the intention of illuminating social, political, and historical events, such as human rights developments, women's history, feminisms, queer history, racial justice movements, and critical race studies. One example of biographical interviews being used to illuminate a larger issue would be the September 11th, 2001 Oral History Project, housed here in the Oral History Archives at Columbia. It includes audio and video interviews with close to 600 people and nearly 1,000 hours of oral history testimony, illuminating the events and the lives of people impacted by the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Here you'll see some of our collecting strengths, as well as current collecting areas that are a priority for us. Thanks for watching this video. If you have further questions, you can email us or visit our FAQ for information about using the archives.